So happy Pride Month. I hear that's the greeting I hear people saying is Happy Pride Month. Um, and I don't know what the greeting is for Juneteenth. Tomorrow, Juneteenth. Do we say Happy Juneteenth? I don't know if people have settled on that. But I want to thank Reverend Martha Cruz, as of tomorrow, a rostered minister of Word and Sacrament in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and Reverend Stephanie Duzant, who is an elder, an ordained elder, African Methodist Episcopal Church. So I'm so glad to be with the both of you again. I feel like we had regular meetings for a couple of months, and then we've kind of, I don't know, gotten away from each other. But I've been wanting to talk to both of you in the wake of January 6th and the insurrection that took place in our nation's capital. There's been discussion about how there needs to be an investigation, there needs to be a commission, and there are other people saying, no, we don't need to do anything. So I kind of think that it deserves a conversation to say what happened, and kind of what do we think the response needs to be at this point. And of course, Juneteenth is a brand new holiday, federal holiday. So lots of things are happening in our country that are hopeful. The Juneteenth holiday, we have to think about, what makes that worthwhile? What would make it just an empty gesture, and what would make it a little more worthwhile? There's a lot of discussion about critical race theory. People probably defining it in different ways, but it's being used as a culture war weapon. And it looks like there's going to be a lot going on for the next year or so about transgender issues. That's going to be a hot political button for the parties to be kind of bouncing around. So would either one of you want to take a crack at the question of, is America a racist country?
Yes, America is a racist country. Being African American, born in America, born to immigrant lineage, from immigrant lineage, I have experienced racism on so many levels. Much of it systemic, and until America is honest with how America gained its wealth, how America gained its infrastructure, we're going to be dealing with racism in this way until it changes. We see it in the law. We see it. I've experienced it in the medical system. I was an investigator and then a supervisor and trainer in child welfare. So we see it with the family systems. We see it in education. We see it in so many ways, that a system that is first built on racist policies and procedures, right? That the police were evolved from slave catchers, right? That the Rikers Island was where the slave was named after a slave catcher, one of the most mean slave catchers out there. Mm-hmm. And so that our police system evolves from that. And we don't want to be honest and say that, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want to be honest and talk about Planned Parenthood, right? And that it started from, right, genocide, stopping Black people from having children. And so, yes, Planned Parenthood is something good now, but we have to be honest about the origins of things. And so until we do racism in this country forever. And it's not just the African American community, it's the Asian community, right? It's the Latino community, Native American communities. If we look at all of these communities and what they've had to deal with in America, yes, America is a racist country, and we have to be honest about that.
Yeah, I agree that racism is the foundation of this country. And I see it too in other countries in the Americas that were colonized by Europeans. And particularly in the Caribbean, the decimation of the indigenous population and the slave trade. In the country in which I was born, slavery wasn't abolished legally for another 20 years after it was in this country, which is just mind-boggling to me.
Mhm.
But I think that the colonization, the European, the whiteness has given us the lens through which we view the world. And I have experienced racism in this country since I was a very little girl, and I've been aware of that since I was a very little girl. Raising a family of mixed race and mixed heritage children has been, an ongoing challenge for us as parents. Our three older daughters, who are from my husband's first marriage, are biracial. They're African American and white, and they still are, when we are together, and people just do not associate, even though they look like him, they don't necessarily associate that these brown-skinned young women can possibly be connected to this white man, which, Pastor Jim, I'm sure is something that your kids and you have experienced as well. And, I look back to, just putting it in the larger perspective of the colonized Americas, how much it probably would not be called racism, because there's this whole, national ethnic identity. If you're Cuban, you're Cuban, but there is racism that is colorism is very, very prominent certainly in Cuban society, and probably other parts of Latin America as well. But I'm talking about Cubans because those are the folks I know. And even, in our own families, there was, in my family, on my maternal side, there is still outright denial that we only have to go back 3 generations to my great-grandmother, who was probably enslaved, and her daughter, my grandmother, who is biracial, the daughter of a Spaniard and a Black woman, was born the year before the emancipation happened in Cuba. So, but that has been denied by a family that could more or less pass as, not Black.
Mhm.
And where, the racism was celebrated whenever a child was born, whether it was, the first generation or the second generation, who happened to be lighter skinned or blonde because they got that from their European side, or had light eyes. So I think that it has become a way in which we see ourselves as the filter, and to break away from that filter and to acknowledge the richness of certainly the diversity in my family, but just the richness of our cultures that have been played down and ignored. And I think that, Pastor Jim mentioned critical race theory, that for me, that also is part and parcel of that, because we have been given a historical narrative that is revisionist, where I have on my shelf over here, and I don't know why I still have it, but it's a copy of, I think, maybe my 6th or 7th grade history textbook that talks about manifest destiny. And
Yes.
yes, and how, this just had to happen. God willed it,
In a textbook.
In a textbook, well, yeah, and it's Catholic school, so it's got that whole, that whole religious overlay over it, that this must have been the will of God. So we have learned revisionist history. I learned in school that there was a war fought between Spain and the United States and Cuba that resulted in independence for Cuba in 1898. What I wasn't taught was that it took 4 full years for the Cuban flag to be permitted by the US to fly over the island,
Right.
and that there was the Platt Amendment and everything else. In this country, I think that those of us who are Latino, who have European descent as well as African descent and indigenous descent, are not always, folks don't know what to do with us. I mean, I have been asked, what are you, many times in my life. My children have been asked, what they are. My children, my biological children, have had a hyphenated surname that was my name and their father's. And they would hear comments about, what kind of wetback name is that? So it's here, it's real. And for us to deny it is just that there's no path that just keeps us in the same place. There's no way of moving beyond this if we can't acknowledge, if we can't name the sin.
Right.
So a lot of this kind of discussion began in January when the United States Senator from South Carolina decided to say there is no racism, or America is not a racist country, I guess was the way he phrased it. And it's continued now with this discussion about critical race theory. So there have been signs popping up in Greenwich now, and we see this conspiracy all coming together. So they wanted people yesterday to show up at the Board of Education in Greenwich to say, let our kids take their masks off and don't teach critical race theory. So there's a way in which all these, these insurrections at state capitals and at our national capital have been insurrections that are anti-mask, anti-vaccine, anti-critical race theory. The way these things all come together is kind of concerning. So as we look at that, and it was interesting to see that we now have a federal holiday, and how people do that will determine how meaningful it is. But I think there was a lot of attention to the Tulsa anniversary. Certainly in Washington, there was a lot of attention to it. That was news to a lot of people, but I think a lot of people heard about it. I don't think there were many people who could avoid it unless they made a real effort to avoid it. And that, of course, came out of the 1619 Project, which really said that that's something that we need to be looking at and understanding as a way of looking at our society. So if you think of, January 6th, I mean, I think that's got to be a date that we keep thinking about. January 6th, what happened on January 6th? It's not something to sweep under the rug. And there are lots of questions that need to be asked, I think. As leaders in the church, what does the church's response need to be? What does our society's response need to be? What do our families need to do? Going forward, I don't think we can be silent about it. I think we need to say that it was based on a big lie. It was incited by a big lie. And now the lie continues to grow that it wasn't an insurrection. But what is the church's response? What should we be doing?
I think the church has to tell the truth. The church has to not put patriotism over righteousness, period. The church has to stand on righteousness and love. And if the church doesn't do that, then we are not preaching the gospel. We are not preaching the truth. Right. And we're putting patriotism, the love of a country, over the love of God's creation, the love of God's people. And so a lot of people don't want to deal with that. But that's just the basic truth, that if we look at the gospel and we look at who Jesus was in the gospels, he would have been against the insurrection. And we can point to so many things in the gospel that show that, right? That he welcomes so many Gentiles, right? And so this whole notion of you in the name of God, we're doing this. The Atlantic put an article out the week of the insurrection talking about the Christian groups that were at the insurrection, that were waving the Confederate flag along with had a cross, and saying that this was of God. And what Bible were they reading? That's what I got to know. What Bible were they reading? Because this is not the gospel. And the church has to stand upon the gospel. If you are putting people's humanity beneath this belief in God, it's an oxymoron. It doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense. Jesus came to save humanity. Jesus came to save humanity. Jesus came so that we will all know how to love one another and be in harmony together. And so if the church doesn't stand on righteousness, then it's not a church. Then it's not the church of Christ. It is not the body, a part of the body of believers. And we have to be bold enough to say that. I don't have a problem saying that this person is not Christian, or that, and even if you call yourself a Christian, I don't care. If you are not standing on righteousness and love, then you are not a Christian. I don't care how much you like Jesus' message. I don't care how much, oh, those are beautiful words. If you're not living that, and if we're not preaching that, then we're not Christians. And we have to be honest and be not afraid to say that.
I agree, Pastor Stephanie. I think that the church has to call out the lie. Again, naming it, naming the demon is the only way to have power over it. I'm struck by when I was watching the insurrection happen right in front of me on my computer in real time. I thought, as an immigrant with all of the issues that we have with, and that I've experienced and my family has, being immigrants in a racist society, there was still one thing that I held on to, was that stuff like that doesn't happen in this country. I mean, this is what my family left Cuba for, because, you don't summon up, an insurrection in order to take power. And there was that anxiety that, is this the path that's going to unfold? And, until it was over, until they reconvened the counting and the certifying of the votes, I was wondering, are we seeing the same thing that we've seen throughout Latin America, that we've seen in other parts of the world? I mean, is that the path that we've gone down? And to call out the big lie is important. But then there are all of these other lies, as both of you mentioned before, that have spun out of that now, they were just a group of tourists. They were peacefully protesting. We're reading a lot lately in the last few days of how Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed, one of the insurrectionists, is now being held up as,
a hero.
A martyr.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And when there is an admission that there was some kind of insurrection, there's a lot of deflection. It was Antifa, it was BLM, now it's the FBI. We need to continue to call these things out.
Yes.
And I think that the challenge is that there's so much interweaving in the United States between Christianity and nationalism, that folks can't separate those two very well.
Again, another reason why critical race theory, but also true church history is important, right? And so why does the church embrace nationalism, right? I found it so ironic that during the second impeachment trial, that Trump's lawyer made a reference to Rome, right?
Right.
And I was like, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Are you going to compare this to the Pax Romana, right? When we know what that was about. But then I had to really ask, how many people do really know what that's about, right? How many people know that Jesus lived during that time, and that one of the things he was fighting against was the Pax Romana, right? Which was the big lie of peace under Rome, right? And then also, how many people understand that when Constantine becomes a Christian, right, that Christianity changes, right? Yeah. And so people say, oh, Constantine was converted to Christianity. No, Christianity was converted to nationalism.
Yes, exactly.
And so,
and even if you look at some of the language that was used, in Rome, the pontifex was the emperor, and then that became the name, the Latin term to refer to the papacy and the head of the church.
Exactly. And these are the things that need to be told, right? Just tell the truth. We don't even have to give it a name. My brother works for the federal government, and he's an investigator for capital cases on the defense side. And so when this whole critical race theory came out, he was like, this is a legal term. It's not even, they've taken a legal term used in the courts to fight against cases and now trying to make it a thing, right? Because you need a buzz phrase. You need buzzwords to get people excited, to get people anxious. But really, just teach the truth. Just teach the truth. My best memory was in the 9th grade. And my social studies teacher, and social studies was my favorite subject, and my social studies teacher, Mr. Randall, I'm going to call him by name because he was a righteous man. And Mr. Randall, a white social studies teacher, we were learning about Abraham Lincoln. And so my classmates, Abraham Lincoln was a great man, and look what he did to free the slaves. And so, because I came from a radical home, I said, he didn't care about Black people. Mm-hmm. In my classroom, they turned on me. It was almost a mob in the class. What do you mean he didn't care about Black people? Mm-hmm. I said, he didn't care about Black people. That was a political move. Mm-hmm. That had nothing to do with loving Black folks and trying to do right by Black people in the 9th grade. Mm-hmm. And they turned to my teacher. And Mr. Randall said, she's 100% correct. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was almost flabbergasted by the truth. That's sad, right? But that he backed me up. He was like, she is telling the truth. That was a political move. It had nothing to do with the love of Black people. Tell the truth. Mm-hmm. Tell the truth. And so my 9th grade class now, like, oh my gosh, really? So now they got to look at things a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. If we tell the truth, even in the same thing with colonization, it's so thank God for all the white missionaries who came and civilized the Caribbean folks. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? When you look at the white missionaries and you read some of their journals from Hawaii to the Caribbean, India, it was all about pushing the agenda, right, of the English, of the German, or whatever country they were coming from, right? And in the Virgin Islands, the Moravians were prominent. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the Moravians only converted slaves. They only converted the enslaved people. And what they don't tell you is that the Moravians had a hand in making sure runaway slaves returned back to their masters. Mm-hmm. Had a hand in trying to get enslaved people not to revolt, not to fight back, but to be good slaves. Mm-hmm. We got to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth, right? And so when you don't tell the truth, people big up these religions and big up these denominations and don't know what role did they played, right? Mm-hmm. In your oppression and in the development of systemic oppression in our society. Mm-hmm.
I heard a story about a group of Native Americans that were visiting with Nancy Pelosi in her office, and they pointed to the picture of Abraham Lincoln in her office, mm-hmm. and they said he was not a friend to the Native Americans.
Wow.
That's right.
And she was like, what are you talking about? Abraham Lincoln is the greatest American ever. So she had not heard that point of view before, and I'm guessing she's reflected on it a little bit now. So for me, I think, that day, watching what was happening, I was in shock. I think a lot of us were in shock. And I just thought to myself, where did these people come from? And, it took me a little time to kind of say, well, they've been here the whole time. I mean, they've been overturning elections, and they've been turning people away from voter registration places. And they've been, whether it's Wilmington or Tulsa, or, when they were talking about Tulsa, I saw a map of, 36 different cities that had, the same kind of thing happen. I really want to go down to Alabama to see Brian Stevens's Equal Justice Initiative headquarters and the memorial that he has to lynching.
Very moving, very moving. Yeah, I've been there. It's when you go in and you just see they have them in different spaces. And so names are on stands and just names, and then names they have them hanging from the rooftop and names, and it's names you know. I took pictures of, like, I know people by this last name. I know people, you know, and no state in America was immune to, you know, there was lynchings all over the country.
I also got to go, I think about 2 years ago, I went to the African American History and Cultural Center. And that is a powerful, powerful experience. I mean, it has a section where you walk past Emmett Till's casket. You know, where you kind of walk through this little space and you're kind of taken through the story of him and kind of brought there in a sense. So, you know, where do these people come from and why are they claiming the church as their, you know, support? Well, the KKK burned crosses, you know, and they burned crosses because they wanted people to know that they were Christians. And they, you know, they gathered in churches, and just like the people on January 6th were praying, you know, for what they were doing, the KKK saw themselves, and the church was probably, you know, the biggest prime force in organizing white supremacy and white nationalism and Christian nationalism. So all these things are easy to trace, that, you know, the abolitionists were not anti-racist. Those people who want to say America is not a racist country, I just want to say to them, well, you know, it used to be, right? I mean, you must admit that it was at some point racist. And so, you know, if you can't do that, then, you know, there's no point in talking to somebody. But I think everybody would say, well, it used to be racist. But so at which point the question is, when did we stop being racist? Tell me when it was that we stopped being racist. Was it when, you know, was it on Juneteenth when the last slaves were freed? Because we still needed an amendment after that. I don't know if any of you have seen on Netflix, I think it is, this series that Will Smith hosts, Amend the Fight for America.
Excellent.
And just that one amendment, just the 14th Amendment, they look at gay rights, and they look at women's reproductive rights, and they look at immigrants' rights, and it all, it didn't come into the Constitution. The word equal was not in the Constitution until they added the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court refused to enforce the 14th Amendment for decades. So, you know, and then you look at someone like Woodrow Wilson. You know, Woodrow Wilson came into a federal government that was integrated and decided, well, we can't have this. So it's not as though there was, you know, steady progress. You know, Woodrow Wilson set the whole country back in terms of, you know, putting the federal government back into Jim Crow. And, you know, Ronald Reagan decided that when he needed to announce that he was a candidate for president, he was the governor of California before that, but he didn't announce in California. He was born in Illinois, I think, but he didn't go to Illinois. He didn't go to Washington, D.C. He went to a little place in Mississippi to say, I am announcing my candidacy for president. And, you know, why is he in Mississippi? And why is he talking about states' rights? And the county that he chose in Mississippi, there's nothing associated with that county. There's nothing of any historical importance except for one thing. And that is, it's the place where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were taken and never seen again until their bodies were pulled out of a lake. You know, gee, why did he pick that county in Mississippi? You know, is there another reason he can give us for why that place was significant? Go to the state capitol, you know, go to.
Well, it's the same reason he went to the South Bronx when he was campaigning. Of all the Black communities you could have went to, you go to the burnt down part of South Bronx to campaign. And so racism, I would ask, you know, when did we stop being racist? We know we're not racist. What the question is, How many races sit at your dinner table? How many races do you break bread with? How many races share your DNA? Let's just be honest, right? And even the people of color, right? How racist are you? And what role do you play in perpetuating the racism?
Exactly.
We have to have these conversations. Pastor Martha talked about the colorism. Where does that come from, right? That comes from Europeans. That comes from the Europeans coming to the Caribbean, making children with the Caribbean, the enslaved and the indigenous people, and then calling them mulatto, right? To separate them. It could be, and you didn't even do that for the love of the children that were yours. You did that because you were afraid and you needed more numbers. Let's just tell the truth and shame the devil. And so,
you know, you mentioned that term because when we were doing some genealogical research, a couple of cousins and I, our grandmother, who was biracial, was described by many in the family as mulata.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I have it in my own family line. I'm doing my own family tree. And many of my cousins on the census were called mulatto. But then I look at how white women can infiltrate the Latinx population and call themselves Latinx and lie, and they don't get vetted.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
And they don't get vetted. We got to call out the racism among us.
Yes, we do.
We got to call out the racism among us. The racism in the churches that make you embrace this happens in the Caribbean, embrace the white people that come down and throw you a bone. And you know, what's the African proverbs? The missionaries came and they told us to pray. When we closed our eyes, we had the land and they had the Bible. When we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. Come on. We got to call it out.
Yep.
We got to call out whatever role we play in this systemic racist oppression, and then make changes.
Yeah.
And then make changes.
I think too that we need part of the education of people in our pews is that everybody assumes, I mean, you know, we're not going to get into the, you know, Jesus was white argument, but
right.
But people assume that Christianity is white because I know that 40 years ago when I started seminary, the church history I learned was only European.
Right.
And we have no knowledge of where indigenous Christian communities arose in Africa, in South Asia. I mean, there are communities in South Asia and India that trace their origins to St. Thomas.
In Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, we just don't have, you know, our knowledge of Christianity is informed by European bias, and folks in our pews don't know that. Many of us didn't know that for a long time.
Right.
We have a Lutheran church in Brooklyn called Salam Lutheran Church.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And they're from Palestine.
Yeah.
And when people tell them, oh, we have a church in Palestine, it's Lutheran, they're like, really? How long have there been Christians in Palestine?
Yeah, really.
That's a new thing. I've never heard of this before.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing with in the Black community. Oh, don't come and tell me about that white Jesus. And Jesus was not white. Can we start there?
Yeah.
Jesus was not white. Can we talk about the Coptic church? Can we talk about when Philip engages the eunuch, right? The Ethiopian eunuch. Can we talk about these things, that the presence of Black people, the presence of people of other cultures was glaring in the Bible, but because, like you say, they don't teach that, right? And so because we don't take the time to learn. Can I say that too?
Yeah, you can say that.
And so we've got to address these things and just tell the truth. I don't need a name. I don't need to be, you don't want to call it critical race theory. You don't want to, just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Give the people the facts and the truth, right? Because facts doesn't always lead to truth, right? But give the people facts that lead to the truth.
Right.
And I think the world would look like a different place, right? And so, but we can't be afraid to do it, right? We can't be afraid to trust righteousness and trust love, to tell the truth, because there are people out there who need to know, who want to know.
I want to
Right.
thank both of you for dropping some wisdom for us, bringing lots of your own stories and your own knowledge, and imparting that wisdom for us. I'm glad that we've made this this introduction maybe for some people, because we need to figure out somehow the people who are not hearing it, who are not getting it, and maybe don't want to get it. You know, where do we start with them? But I want to thank you both
Thank you.
for your time.
Thank you.
And for
Thank you for facilitating this, Pastor Jim.
Yes.
Happy Pride, happy
Yeah.
Juneteenth.
Yes,
Let us remember the Emmanuel 9 and honor their memory.
yes, yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.